Moses wasn't born in a palace, nor did he grow up as a warrior or king. He was just a baby placed in a basket on the river, destined to be one among many. But God had greater plans. How did a simple man, running from his past, become the greatest leader Israel has ever known? What made him the chosen one to free an entire nation from captivity? If you think you already know the story, get ready to uncover the surprising details that show how God transformed Moses into a true giant of faith. This is a journey that will inspire you. Moses' story begins at a time when the people of Israel were suffering immensely. They had been living as slaves in Egypt for many years, oppressed and burdened by the harsh rule of a pharaoh who saw them as a threat. The Israelites, once welcomed into Egypt during Joseph's time, had multiplied greatly, and their numbers worried the Egyptians. In an attempt to maintain control and prevent an uprising, Pharaoh issued a horrifying decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River and killed. This was more than just an act of cruelty. It was an attempt to erase the future of an entire nation. In the midst of this dark period, a child was born into a Levite family. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, looked at their son with love and fear, knowing that his life was in imminent danger. Yet something stirred in their hearts. They saw that this child was special, and they were filled with a faith that defied Pharaoh's command. For 3 long months they hid their baby boy, holding on to hope and trusting that God had a plan. But as every parent knows, you can't hide a growing child forever. And so, Jochebed made a decision that would test her faith in ways she could never have imagined. She wove a basket from reeds, coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, and placed her precious son inside. With trembling hands, she set the basket adrift on the Nile, releasing her son into the unknown, trusting that somehow God would protect him. As that tiny basket floated down the river, it must have felt like every wave, every ripple, was a moment of uncertainty. Can you imagine the anguish Jochebed felt, watching her child slip out of her grasp and into the waters of the Nile? Yet, it was in this moment of complete surrender that God began to work. He guided that basket, leading it directly to the spot where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. Now, think about this. The very family responsible for the decree of death would be the one to offer Moses a chance at life. When Pharaoh's daughter opened the basket and saw the crying baby, something softened in her heart. Instead of rejecting him, she decided to raise him as her own. She named him Moses, meaning drawn out, because he was drawn out of the water. But there was a deeper meaning behind this name. Moses was destined to draw God's people out of the waters of despair and bondage, to lead them to freedom. And here's where the story gets even more incredible. Moses' sister Miriam had been watching everything from a distance. She had seen her brother placed in that basket, had witnessed it being discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, and then, with remarkable courage, approached her. Miriam offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. And who did she bring? None other than Jochebed, Moses' own mother. By God's divine orchestration, Jochebed was able to care for her son once more, but this time under the protection of the royal palace. Imagine the relief, the joy, and the gratitude she must have felt. Not only was her son saved, but she was given the opportunity to be with him during his most formative years, to whisper into his ears the stories of their people, the promises of God, and the hope that one day they would be free. It's amazing how God worked through such impossible circumstances, isn't it? He used what seemed like a desperate act of surrender, placing a baby in a river, as the very means to position Moses in a place of privilege and power. Through Pharaoh's daughter, Moses was given access to the best education, the wealth of Egypt, and the training of a prince. What the enemy meant for destruction, God turned into preparation. Moses wasn't just any child. He was being groomed for a destiny that would change the course of history. And it all began with a mother's faith, a sister's bravery, and God's unwavering hand of protection. Growing up within the walls of Pharaoh's palace, Moses experienced a life of luxury and privilege that most could only dream of. He wasn't just any child in Egypt, he was raised as a prince. Imagine the contrast. An Israelite boy, meant to be one of the enslaved, now living among Egypt's elite, surrounded by the splendor and knowledge of the most advanced civilization of that time. Pharaoh's palace was a place of power, authority, and wealth, and Moses had access to all of it. He was trained in the art of warfare, educated in the sciences, mathematics, literature, and learned the ways of Egyptian leadership. Day by day, he grew in wisdom and stature, becoming a man who appeared destined for greatness. But as Moses grew older, something began to stir within him. You see, no matter how much privilege or comfort he enjoyed, there was always this undeniable truth that echoed in his heart. He wasn't Egyptian. He was Hebrew. He might have worn the garments of a prince, eaten from the tables of royalty, and lived within the grandeur of Pharaoh's palace. But deep down, his identity was rooted in the people who were being oppressed, the ones who toiled day and night under the scorching sun. How many times do we too find ourselves in situations where, despite all appearances, something within us reminds us of who we truly are? Moses had a choice to make. Would he continue to live as an Egyptian prince, ignoring the plight of his own people, or would he embrace his true identity, even if it meant facing hardship? It's easy to get caught up in the comforts of this world, isn't it? To allow ourselves to be defined by our surroundings, our achievements, or the roles we've been given. Moses had every reason to stay where he was. He had power, influence, and a future in the greatest empire on earth. But something inside of him refused to be silent. He could not turn a blind eye to the suffering of his people. The Bible tells us in Hebrews 11:24 through 25 that by faith, Moses, when he was grown, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. This was a pivotal moment in Moses' life, one that defined his character and set the stage for the journey that was about to unfold. Moses' life in the palace wasn't just about education or luxury, it was a period of preparation. God was molding him, equipping him with the skills, knowledge, and insights that he would later need to fulfill his destiny. It's a reminder to all of us that even when we find ourselves in places that seem far removed from our calling, God can still be at work, preparing us for something greater. The years Moses spent in the palace were not wasted. Every lesson he learned, every challenge he faced, every aspect of leadership he observed, all of it was shaping him into the leader he would one day become. But with this knowledge and privilege also came the weight of responsibility. It's one thing to know about suffering from a distance, but it's another to feel it, to witness it firsthand. And that's exactly what happened to Moses. One day, as he walked among his people, he saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave. It was as if all the years of his life came crashing together in that single moment, the comfort of the palace and the harsh reality of his people's suffering. Unable to stand by and do nothing, Moses intervened, striking down the Egyptian and hiding his body in the sand. It was an impulsive act, a moment of anger and desperation, but it revealed a heart that could not tolerate injustice. Moses had made his choice. He couldn't remain silent any longer. Yet, this act would change everything. By stepping in, Moses broke the illusion of security that the palace had provided. He was no longer just an adopted prince. He had aligned himself with the oppressed, and in doing so, he placed himself in direct opposition to the power of Pharaoh. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes, standing up for what's right can come with great personal cost. For Moses, it meant leaving behind the life he had always known and embarking on a path that was uncertain and full of danger. But it was a path that would ultimately lead him to fulfill the purpose God had ordained for him. Moses' life up to this point had been a series of contrasts, raised as an Egyptian prince, but born as a Hebrew slave. This internal struggle began to manifest itself more clearly as he grew older, and the divide between his two worlds became harder to ignore. There's something deeply relatable about this kind of identity crisis, isn't there? Many of us, at some point, have found ourselves torn between two identities, two paths, or two sets of expectations. For Moses, this wasn't just a matter of personal confusion. It was a struggle that would define his purpose and destiny. Imagine Moses standing on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the city of Egypt, seeing the grandeur, the wealth, the power. Yet beyond the palace walls, he saw a very different reality, the harsh lives of his own people, the Israelites, who labored under the whip of their oppressors. He had everything at his fingertips: wealth, knowledge, power, and a future in one of the greatest empires in history. But what did it matter if his heart wasn't at peace? This is a reminder that the things of this world can never truly satisfy us if we're not living in alignment with who God created us to be. The conflict within Moses was growing stronger, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to make a choice. This internal battle reached a boiling point on that fateful day, when Moses witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. In that moment, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just anger, it was a deep-seated sense of injustice, a recognition that he could no longer stand idly by while his people suffered. In a fit of rage, Moses struck down the Egyptian, killing him. It was a decision made in the heat of the moment, but it revealed something profound about Moses' character. He was willing to fight for what he believed in, even if it meant risking everything he had. But this act also set him on a collision course with his destiny. Word of what Moses had done spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Pharaoh himself heard about the incident. Suddenly, Moses was no longer just a prince. He was a fugitive, a man with a price on his head. In that single act of violence, he had burned the bridge back to his life of luxury. He had chosen a side, and there was no going back. It's a powerful lesson for all of us. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means losing everything you've ever known. It means walking away from the comfort and security of the familiar to step into the unknown, trusting that God has a plan, even when you can't see the path ahead. Fleeing into the wilderness, Moses left behind the life he had always known. He was stripped of his title, his status, and his identity as an Egyptian prince. But in the process, he began to discover who he truly was. In the solitude of the desert, Moses found himself face to face with his own humanity, his fears, and his weaknesses. There was no more palace, no more luxury, no more hiding from the truth. This was a period of refining, a time when God began to strip away everything that wasn't meant to be part of Moses' identity, to reveal the leader that he was destined to become. It's in these moments of isolation and uncertainty that we often come to understand who we truly are and who God has called us to be. Sometimes, God allows us to go through seasons of wandering and searching, not to punish us, but to prepare us. For Moses, this journey into the wilderness was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately lead him to become one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. And so, even as he wandered through the desert, far removed from the palace he once called home, Moses was being prepared, molded, and shaped by God for a mission that would change the course of history. One of the most defining moments in Moses' life occurred on that day when he witnessed an Egyptian overseer mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. In that split second, the duality of his existence, the Prince of Egypt and the Hebrew by birth, collided with a force that could no longer be ignored. Deep within him, something stirred, something that refused to remain silent any longer. It wasn't just rage, it was an overwhelming sense of injustice, the realization that his people were suffering while he stood by in a position of privilege and power. In an impulsive act of defiance, Moses struck the Egyptian, and with a single blow, ended his life. It was a moment of raw emotion, of righteous anger, and for the first time, Moses took a stand, albeit in a way that would forever alter the course of his life. This act of violence was not just the killing of an Egyptian, it was the death of the identity Moses had been clinging to. In that instant, he chose to break away from the comfortable life of luxury and power, aligning himself with the plight of his people. It was as if he could no longer bear the weight of pretending, the weight of living a lie. Yet, with this decision came consequences that were swift and severe. News of the killing spread quickly, and Pharaoh's wrath was immediate. Moses, once a favored prince, became a hunted man. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no going back. Everything he had known was stripped away, and he found himself running for his life, leaving behind the wealth, power, and security that had defined his existence. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? One moment, Moses was in a position of unimaginable privilege, and in the next, he was fleeing into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back. It's a stark reminder that sometimes taking a stand for what's right requires immense sacrifice. We might not be faced with the same kind of life or death situations, but we all encounter moments where we must choose between comfort and conviction, between staying silent and stepping out in faith. Moses fled into the desert, a place of barrenness and solitude. It might seem like a harsh punishment, but in reality, it was the beginning of Moses' transformation. The desert became his sanctuary, a place where he could strip away all the false identities and expectations that had been placed on him. Away from the distractions of Egyptian wealth and culture, Moses began to confront himself, his fears, his failures, and the question that had haunted him his entire life: who am I? It's often in the wilderness, in those moments of isolation and uncertainty, that we find the answers we've been searching for. When everything else is stripped away, that's when God does his most profound work in our lives. The image of Moses running through the desert, his heart pounding with fear and uncertainty, is a powerful one. It's the moment where he leaves behind not just Egypt, but the false identity that Egypt had given him. He wasn't meant to be just another prince, another cog in the machine of a powerful empire. God had a far greater plan for him, a purpose that could only be discovered through the pain of losing everything he thought he needed. This phase of fleeing into the wilderness wasn't a punishment, it was preparation. Moses needed to learn what it meant to be humble, to be stripped of all his titles and privileges, so that he could become the leader God intended him to be. As Moses disappeared into the vast, empty expanse of the desert, he had no idea what lay ahead. He didn't know that this journey, which seemed to be the end of everything he had known, would actually be the start of something far greater. In his darkest hour, God was beginning to write the next chapter of his story, one that would eventually lead him back to Egypt, not as a prince, but as a prophet, as a deliverer, and as the greatest leader Israel would ever know. It's a reminder to us all that sometimes God's greatest work in our lives begins in the wilderness. Arriving in the land of Midian, Moses found himself in a completely different world from the grandeur of Egypt. The golden palaces, bustling marketplaces, and the power he once wielded were replaced by the simplicity and isolation of the desert. It must have felt like he had traded a life of royalty for one of obscurity. But isn't it interesting how God often uses such unexpected places to prepare us for our true calling? Sometimes it's in the quiet, in the spaces where we feel the most alone, that we hear God's voice the clearest. In Midian, Moses became a shepherd, tending flocks of sheep day in and day out. For someone who had been raised as a prince, this was a humbling experience, a complete stripping away of his former identity. Imagine the thoughts that must have run through his mind during those long, solitary hours in the wilderness. The questions, the doubts, the regrets. Was this truly what his life had come to? Yet, it was precisely here, in this place of obscurity, that God was shaping him, molding him, and teaching him lessons that the wealth and power of Egypt could never impart. As he cared for the sheep, he was unknowingly being trained to shepherd a much larger flock, the nation of Israel. Moses' time in Midian wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. He had to unlearn the ways of Egypt and embrace a new identity, one that was rooted not in power or privilege, but in humility and service. It's a lesson many of us can relate to. There are seasons in life where we feel forgotten, where our dreams seem distant and our purpose unclear. But it's often in these very seasons that God is doing his most profound work within us, preparing us for something far greater than we could ever imagine. During his time in Midian, Moses encountered Jethro, the priest of Midian, who would eventually become his father-in-law. It was through Jethro that Moses found a new family, a new community, and a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in a long time. He married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and started a family. For the first time in years, Moses experienced a semblance of stability, a quiet life far removed from the turmoil of Egypt. Yet, even in this season of contentment, God had not forgotten him. The wilderness was not the end of Moses' story. It was merely the beginning of a greater journey that lay ahead. Every day, as Moses led his flock through the rugged terrain of Midian, he was unknowingly rehearsing for the task that God had destined for him. Each step through the barren desert, each challenge he faced while caring for his sheep, was equipping him with the patience, resilience, and strength he would one day need to lead an entire nation to freedom. The wilderness became his training ground, the place where God refined him, stripped away his pride, and prepared him to be the leader he was always meant to be. It's easy to overlook the significance of this chapter in Moses' life, to see it as merely a time of waiting or as a punishment for his past actions. But the truth is, it was in this quiet, hidden place that Moses truly found himself. It was here that he learned the value of humility, the importance of perseverance, and the necessity of relying on God above all else. And isn't that a lesson for all of us? Sometimes it's in the seasons of obscurity, when we feel the most lost, that God is preparing us for our greatest purpose. One day, while tending to his father-in-law's sheep, Moses wandered deep into the wilderness, reaching a place known as Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. As he went about his routine, something extraordinary caught his eye, a bush that was engulfed in flames, yet strangely, it wasn't being consumed. Imagine that moment, the quiet stillness of the desert, the blazing heat, and then suddenly, this unexplainable sight. Moses, curious and drawn to this mysterious phenomenon, stepped closer to investigate, and in that exact moment, his life was about to change forever. As Moses approached the bush, a voice called out to him, "Moses, Moses." It was God himself speaking, and Moses responded with a simple, "Here I am." Can you imagine hearing the voice of God so clearly, so unmistakably, in the middle of nowhere? God told him to take off his sandals, for he was standing on holy ground. It's remarkable, isn't it, how God transforms ordinary places into sacred spaces when he meets us there? In the midst of Moses' everyday life, God broke through the mundane and revealed his divine presence. God introduced himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who had made promises to Moses' ancestors generations ago. And here, at this moment, God was about to fulfill one of the greatest promises of all time. He told Moses that he had seen the suffering of the Israelites, that he had heard their cries, and that he was ready to deliver them from the hands of the Egyptians. God's heart was moved by the pain of his people, and now he was about to intervene in a mighty way. But what must have shocked Moses the most was when God declared that he was sending him, Moses, to Pharaoh to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. This was the very place Moses had fled from, the land where he had once lived as a prince, but now feared as a fugitive. Overwhelmed, Moses questioned, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" It's a question many of us ask when God calls us to step into something far greater than we feel capable of handling. Yet God didn't respond by highlighting Moses' qualifications or skills. Instead, he simply said, "I will be with you." This encounter with God at the burning bush was a pivotal moment in Moses' journey. It wasn't just about a mission or a task. It was about Moses discovering who God truly was, and in turn, understanding who he was meant to be. God revealed his name to Moses, "I am who I am." This declaration wasn't just a name. It was a statement of God's eternal presence, his unchanging nature, and his boundless power. It was a reminder that, no matter how impossible the task ahead seemed, the one who was sending him was greater than any obstacle he would face. In that sacred encounter, Moses' fears, doubts, and insecurities were laid bare. But God wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for obedience. He wasn't looking for someone who had all the answers, but for someone who was willing to trust him, even when the path seemed uncertain. This burning bush moment was a turning point, the moment when Moses transitioned from being a shepherd of sheep to becoming the shepherd of an entire nation. It's incredible how God uses the most unexpected moments to reveal his purpose for our lives. In the middle of a desert, in the middle of what seemed like an ordinary day, God called Moses to something extraordinary. And that's often how he works in our lives as well. When we least expect it, in the places where we feel most inadequate or unprepared, God meets us and calls us into his grand story. As God laid out his plan for Moses to return to Egypt and lead his people to freedom, Moses felt a wave of insecurity wash over him. Despite witnessing the miracle of the burning bush and hearing God's voice, he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task. He questioned, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you?'" Moses' fear and doubt were evident, and perhaps many of us can relate to this. Even when God makes his intentions clear, we often find ourselves questioning whether we're truly capable, whether we have what it takes, or if anyone will believe in us. God, in his patience, didn't dismiss Moses' fears. Instead, he provided reassurance. He asked Moses, "What is that in your hand?" Moses replied, "A staff." And with that ordinary staff, God demonstrated his extraordinary power, turning it into a serpent and then back into a staff again. He showed Moses that what might seem simple or insignificant could become powerful when touched by the hand of God. It's a reminder that God doesn't call us because of what we have, but because of what he can do through us. But even after witnessing these miracles, Moses' insecurities remained. He pleaded with God, saying, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Moses felt unqualified, unworthy, and entirely inadequate for the mission. Yet, God responded with a profound truth. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. In essence, God was reminding Moses that it wasn't about his ability, but about God's ability to work through him. Even after all this reassurance, Moses still hesitated, asking God to send someone else. This is where many of us might see ourselves in Moses' story. Even when faced with undeniable evidence of God's power, we allow our insecurities and fears to hold us back. We focus more on our weaknesses than on the strength of the one who calls us. But God, in his infinite mercy, didn't abandon Moses. Instead, he provided Aaron, Moses' brother, to assist him. He promised that Aaron would be the spokesperson, and together, they would accomplish the mission. What's remarkable about this moment is that God didn't wait for Moses to become confident or fearless. He didn't wait for Moses to feel ready. Instead, he met Moses right where he was, in his insecurity, his fear, and his hesitation, and assured him that his presence would be enough. This part of Moses' journey serves as a powerful reminder that God's call doesn't require us to be perfect. It simply requires us to be willing. God's strength is made perfect in our weaknesses, and it's often in the areas where we feel most inadequate that his glory shines the brightest. In this exchange, we see that Moses' journey was not just about freeing a nation, but about being transformed himself. Every step, every hesitation, and every doubt was molding him into the leader God had destined him to be. Sometimes, the greatest battles we face are not against external challenges, but the internal struggles of insecurity, doubt, and fear. And just like Moses, we must learn to trust that when God calls us, he equips us. Moses, now filled with the strength and assurance that came from God's promise, began his journey back to Egypt, the land he had fled from so many years before. This return was not just a geographical journey, but a step into his destiny, facing the very fears that had once driven him away. He traveled alongside his brother Aaron, who had become his mouthpiece, as God had instructed. Each step they took towards Egypt was a step closer to fulfilling God's plan, yet Moses must have felt the weight of what was to come, the confrontation with the most powerful man in the known world, Pharaoh. Upon arriving, Moses and Aaron approached Pharaoh with the message that God had given them. They stood before the mighty ruler, not with armies or weapons, but with words. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" Pharaoh, as expected, responded with contempt. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." This rejection was not just a refusal of Moses' request, but a direct challenge to God's authority. It was a battle of wills between the earthly power of Pharaoh and the divine power of God. The refusal of Pharaoh was not surprising, but it must have felt like a blow to Moses. Here he was, standing in obedience to the God who had sent him, and yet his request was met with defiance. Sometimes, even when we follow God's leading, we face opposition. and it's easy to question whether we're on the right path. But Moses didn't turn away. He didn't allow Pharaoh's arrogance to diminish his resolve. Instead, he continued to present God's demands, knowing that the Almighty was with him, even in the face of rejection. As Pharaoh's heart hardened, God began to display his power in a way that Egypt had never seen. Through Moses and Aaron, the plagues began to strike the land. Waters turned to blood, frogs filled the streets, gnats covered the land, and flies swarmed every corner. Each plague was not just a demonstration of God's might, but a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt. It was as if God was saying, "You may not know me now, but you will." Every act of judgment was a declaration that there was no power greater than the God of Israel. And with each display of divine power, Pharaoh's resistance only grew stronger, his heart becoming even more hardened. In witnessing these events, Moses must have experienced a mixture of awe and fear. He was seeing firsthand the power of God that he had doubted in himself. Yet, he watched as Pharaoh's stubbornness caused more suffering for the people. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the path to freedom and redemption isn't straightforward. There are battles to be fought, hearts to be challenged, and resistance to be met. But even in the face of such stubborn opposition, Moses stood firm, knowing that God's word would not return void. The confrontation with Pharaoh was more than a battle between two men. It was a cosmic struggle between the kingdom of God and the powers of darkness. Moses wasn't just confronting a king, he was challenging the very forces that held his people captive. And in doing so, he was learning a lesson that would carry him throughout his life as a leader. When God is with you, no opposition is too great. The journey back to Egypt and the stand against Pharaoh marked a turning point, not just in Moses' life, but in the story of God's people. It was a declaration that no matter how powerful the enemy might seem, God's purpose will always prevail. The story of the 10 plagues is one of the most profound demonstrations of God's power and sovereignty in the Bible. As Pharaoh's heart grew harder with each encounter, God began to reveal his might in ways that the world had never seen. What started as a simple demand to let my people go escalated into a series of devastating plagues that shook the very foundation of Egypt's society. Each plague wasn't just a random act of nature, but a deliberate statement against the gods of Egypt and a message to Pharaoh that there was only one true God. The first plague turned the Nile River, the very lifeblood of Egypt, into blood. This was more than a mere inconvenience. It was an attack on the heart of Egyptian life and culture. The Nile was worshipped as a god, a source of sustenance and prosperity. By turning it to blood, God showed that he had power over what the Egyptians held sacred, proving that their deities were powerless in the face of his might. Imagine the panic and confusion as the river, which they relied on for survival, became a symbol of death. Fish floated to the surface, the stench filled the air, and the people were left scrambling to find clean water. But even as the Nile bled, Pharaoh remained stubborn. Then came the plague of frogs, an overwhelming invasion that took over homes, beds, and even kitchens. Frogs, considered sacred by the Egyptians, were suddenly everywhere, becoming a source of discomfort and revulsion. And yet, Pharaoh's heart was unyielding. The plagues continued. Gnats that covered people and animals, flies that swarmed every corner, a severe livestock disease that wiped out the Egyptians' cattle, painful boils that appeared on their skin, and devastating hail that destroyed crops and homes. Each plague struck deeper into the heart of Egypt, dismantling their economy, their beliefs, and their sense of security. Yet, despite the increasing severity, Pharaoh continued to resist. It's astounding how pride and arrogance can blind us, even when the evidence is right before our eyes. It was as if Pharaoh was in a battle of wills against God himself, refusing to acknowledge the truth, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. How often do we, too, hold on to our own stubbornness, even when God is clearly trying to get our attention? The plagues grew even more intense. Swarms of locusts devoured what little crops remained after the hail, leaving Egypt on the brink of famine. Darkness covered the land for 3 days, a darkness so thick that it could be felt, a terrifying reminder that without God's light, there is only despair. Pharaoh's heart might have softened momentarily, but each time relief came, he hardened it once more, refusing to let the Israelites go. Finally, the 10th and most devastating plague arrived: the death of every firstborn son in Egypt, from the house of Pharaoh to the humblest servant, even the firstborn of the livestock. This final act of judgment shook Egypt to its core. There was no escape, no hiding from the reality that the God of Israel was far greater than any power they had ever known. The wailing cries of grief filled the land as Pharaoh's resistance was finally broken. This ultimate act demonstrated not just God's power, but his absolute authority over life and death. And through this moment of profound pain and loss, the door to freedom was finally opened for the Israelites. The plagues weren't just acts of judgment, they were acts of revelation. God was revealing himself as the one true God, greater than any force, any king, or any false deity. Through the plagues, he dismantled the idols of Egypt and made a path for his people to walk into their destiny. The story of the 10 plagues stands as a powerful reminder that God's plans cannot be thwarted, and when he moves, nothing can stand in his way. The night of the Passover marked a pivotal moment in the history of Israel and the journey of Moses. After 9 devastating plagues, it was clear that Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and his refusal to let the Israelites go persisted. God then announced one final decisive act: the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian household. This act would be the climax of God's judgment on Egypt, a powerful and undeniable statement of his sovereignty and the lengths he would go to free his people. But amidst this impending judgment, God provided a way of escape, a plan of protection for the Israelites. This plan was the institution of the Passover. Each family was instructed to take a spotless lamb, an animal without defect, and sacrifice it. The blood of this lamb was to be smeared on the doorposts and lintels of their homes as a sign, a declaration that those within were under God's protection. It was a powerful symbol. The blood of an innocent lamb would act as a shield, sparing them from the judgment that would sweep through the land that night. Can you imagine the emotions in the households of the Israelites that night? The tension, the anticipation, the mixture of fear and faith as they painted their doorways with the lamb's blood, knowing that this act of obedience could mean the difference between life and death. This moment wasn't just about escaping a plague. It was about trust, obedience, and faith in God's promise. That night, as the angel of death passed through Egypt, every house marked by the blood of the lamb was spared. The firstborn within those homes remained untouched, while across Egypt, a great cry of anguish and grief arose as the Egyptians discovered the loss of their loved ones. In that moment of darkness and judgment, the Israelites experienced God's deliverance firsthand. It wasn't just the lamb's blood that saved them, it was their faith in God's word, their willingness to act on his command, that led to their salvation. This event, the Passover, became a cornerstone of Jewish faith and identity, a yearly reminder of God's power to save, to redeem, and to bring his people out of bondage. It was more than just a story. It was a living testimony of God's faithfulness, a celebration of how he made a way where there seemed to be no way. The Israelites didn't just leave Egypt, they were liberated, carrying with them the promise that they were God's chosen people, destined for a greater purpose. The exodus that followed was a triumph like no other. With their Egyptian oppressors finally broken, the Israelites left their chains behind and walked into freedom, led by Moses, who had faithfully answered God's call despite his fears and insecurities. And as they moved forward, they did so with the reminder of that night forever etched in their hearts, the night when the blood of a lamb marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for them, but for all who would come after. It's a story that echoes even today, a reminder that God's deliverance is always at hand, even in the darkest of times. Just as God provided a way out for the Israelites, guiding them from bondage to freedom, there are moments in our lives when we seek a breakthrough, a miracle that can only come from a divine touch. This reminds me of something truly life-changing that has been impacting countless believers: the miracle of the 7-day healing. If you're longing for a deeper connection with God, if you've been praying for a revelation or a transformation in your life, this guide is for you. It's designed to help you experience a profound spiritual awakening, a journey that can bring you closer to God's promises and power. The link is right there in the pinned comment. Take this step of faith and discover how God can work miracles in your life, just as he did for Moses and the people of Israel. The journey through the desert was one of the most challenging and defining periods for Moses and the Israelites. After escaping the oppression of Egypt, they found themselves in a vast, barren wilderness. But the desert wasn't just a place of physical hardship. It was a place where their faith, obedience, and trust in God were put to the ultimate test. The Israelites faced hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. But these trials weren't meant to destroy them. They were meant to mold them, to refine their hearts, and to draw them closer to the one who had delivered them. One of the first challenges they faced was the lack of water. Can you imagine being in a scorching desert with no source of water in sight and feeling like hope is slipping away? The people began to grumble and question why they had left Egypt, forgetting the miracles they had just witnessed. Yet, in that moment of desperation, God showed his unwavering faithfulness. At the command of God, Moses struck a rock, and from that dry, lifeless stone, water poured out, providing life and relief to the people. This miracle wasn't just about quenching their thirst. It was a reminder that God could bring life out of the most hopeless situations, that he was still with them even in the harshest circumstances. But their struggles didn't end there. The Israelites grew hungry, and once again, doubts and complaints filled the air. They remembered the food they had in Egypt and longed for the comfort of the familiar, even if it meant returning to bondage. It's a powerful reflection of how sometimes we too are tempted to look back at our past when the future seems uncertain. In that moment, God provided manna, bread from heaven, a daily reminder of his provision and care. Each morning, the Israelites would wake up to this miraculous food, teaching them to rely on God daily. He didn't provide in excess, but just enough for each day, training them to trust him step by step. There were also moments when the people faced battles, like the time they encountered the Amalekites. It wasn't just a physical fight, but a lesson in dependence on God. As long as Moses kept his hands raised, holding the staff of God, the Israelites were victorious. But when his arms grew tired, the enemy began to gain the upper hand. Aaron and Hur, recognizing the importance of this act, supported Moses' arms, ensuring that they remained lifted. It was a powerful image of how, even in our moments of weakness, God surrounds us with others who help us, who lift us up, so that we can keep going and win the battles set before us. These experiences in the desert were more than just trials. They were opportunities for growth, lessons in faith, and moments that shaped the identity of the Israelites as God's chosen people. The desert taught them that God wasn't just a deliverer from Egypt. He was a sustainer, a provider, and a guide through every season of life. It's a lesson that echoes through time, reminding us that even in our deserts, God is working, molding, and preparing us for something greater. The moment when God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses stands as one of the most pivotal events in the Bible. It was more than just a set of rules. It was the foundation of a covenant, a sacred agreement between God and his people. After months of traveling through the harsh wilderness, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, a towering and imposing mountain that would soon become the place where heaven and earth would meet. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, as God himself was about to speak to his people. Moses was called to ascend the mountain, and as he did, a thick cloud descended, covering the peak. There were flashes of lightning, the ground trembled, and a trumpet sound echoed through the valleys, growing louder and louder. It was a display of God's majesty and power, and it left the people below in awe and reverence. Can you imagine standing at the foot of that mountain, witnessing such a sight, feeling the earth shake beneath your feet, and hearing the voice of God himself? It must have been an overwhelming, humbling experience, a reminder of the greatness of the one who had delivered them from slavery. God then began to speak, and his words were etched into the tablets of stone, the Ten Commandments. These weren't just arbitrary rules. They were a blueprint for how to live a life that honored God and respected others. The first 4 commandments focused on the relationship between God and man, emphasizing the importance of placing God first, not worshiping idols, honoring his name, and remembering the Sabbath. The remaining 6 dealt with human relationships, teaching the values of honoring one's parents, valuing life, maintaining fidelity, respecting others' possessions, speaking truthfully, and being content with what one has. These commandments served as a moral compass, a guide to living a life of righteousness and justice. They weren't given to restrict or burden the people, but to set them apart as a holy nation, distinct from the other nations around them. Through these commandments, God was teaching the Israelites what it meant to be His people, to reflect His character in their actions, and to build a society founded on love, respect, and justice. It was a divine revelation that would shape not only the destiny of Israel, but would echo throughout history, influencing countless cultures and legal systems across the world. The delivery of the Ten Commandments also revealed something profound about God's desire for relationship. He wasn't a distant deity who simply imposed His will. He sought a deep and meaningful connection with His people. The commandments were an invitation to walk with Him, to know Him, and to experience His love and holiness in everyday life. It's a reminder that God's laws aren't just rules to be followed. They're expressions of His heart, guiding us to live in harmony with Him and with one another. The story takes a dramatic turn, with an event that highlights human nature's inclination to stray, even after witnessing the power and presence of God. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, receiving the Ten Commandments directly from God, the Israelites below grew restless and impatient. Days turned into weeks, and their leader was nowhere to be seen. Fear, doubt, and a longing for something tangible began to creep into their hearts. This moment of uncertainty exposed a weakness in their faith, a need for immediate answers, and something they could see and touch. It's a feeling many of us can relate to, those times when God feels distant, and we yearn for something to reassure us. In their impatience, the Israelites approached Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded that he make them a god to lead them. Aaron, perhaps feeling the pressure of the crowd or doubting his own ability to stand firm in Moses' absence, gave in to their request. He asked the people to bring him their gold jewelry, earrings, bracelets, and other precious items. From this gold, he fashioned a calf, a lifeless idol that would become a representation of their rebellion against God. The people then proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Imagine the sheer irony and heartbreak of this moment. After experiencing God's mighty hand in their deliverance from Egypt, they turned to an object made by human hands to lead them. The scene that unfolded next was one of chaos and spiritual blindness. The Israelites celebrated around the golden calf, dancing and offering sacrifices as if this piece of metal had been their savior. It was more than just a lapse in judgment. It was a direct affront to the God who had shown them such grace, mercy, and power. They traded the glory of the Almighty for the image of a lifeless idol. This wasn't just an act of idolatry. It was a rejection of their identity as God's chosen people, a people meant to be set apart, and it showed just how quickly human hearts can turn away from truth when faced with uncertainty. As all of this was happening at the base of the mountain, Moses remained in God's presence, unaware of the rebellion taking place below. However, God saw everything and told Moses what the Israelites were doing, expressing His righteous anger at their actions. God even declared that He would destroy them and start a new nation from Moses himself. But here, we witness another defining moment in Moses' life, a moment that showcases his growth as a leader and his deep love for his people. Instead of agreeing with God's plan, Moses interceded for the Israelites, pleading for mercy and reminding God of His promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses then descended from Mount Sinai with the stone tablets in hand, only to be confronted with the full extent of Israel's disobedience. In his righteous fury, he threw down the tablets, shattering them at the base of the mountain, a symbolic act showing how the people had already broken their covenant with God. He confronted Aaron, demanding an explanation, and Aaron's response was a mix of excuses and an attempt to shift blame, saying that the calf had simply appeared from the fire after throwing in the gold. It was a moment that revealed the consequences of weak leadership and the dangers of giving in to fear and pressure. Moses then took the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. This act was not just punishment, it was a powerful reminder of the futility and emptiness of the idols they had chosen to worship. The bitterness they tasted was a reflection of the bitter consequences of turning away from God. This episode serves as a stark warning about how quickly we can lose sight of God's presence when we allow fear, doubt, or impatience to take root in our hearts. It challenges us to examine the idols we might be creating in our own lives and to remember that nothing can replace the true and living God who leads us. The journey to the Promised Land was a defining chapter in the story of Moses and the Israelites. After witnessing countless miracles, receiving God's commandments, and enduring trials, the people of Israel continued their long trek through the wilderness, moving ever closer to the land that God had promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This journey was not just a physical one, it was deeply spiritual, a path that tested their faith, obedience, and trust in God's guidance. Every step they took was an opportunity to grow, to learn to depend on God, and to understand that His promises would always come to fruition, even if the journey seemed endless. Moses led them faithfully, often serving as the mediator between the people and God. He dealt with their doubts, fears, and constant complaints. Despite witnessing miracles like manna falling from heaven, water flowing from rocks, and even the parting of the Red Sea, the Israelites struggled with doubt and disbelief. They questioned God's plans and sometimes longed to return to the slavery they knew in Egypt rather than face the uncertainty of the wilderness. It's a powerful reflection of human nature, how we often cling to the familiar, even when God calls us to something far greater. One of the most significant moments during this journey was when the Israelites reached the border of Canaan, the Promised Land. Moses sent 12 spies to explore the land and bring back a report. After 40 days, the spies returned, carrying with them fruit that proved the land was indeed flowing with milk and honey, just as God had said. However, 10 of the spies spoke of the giants living there and the fortified cities, spreading fear and doubt among the people. Only Joshua and Caleb stood firm, declaring that with God's help, they could conquer the land. Unfortunately, the Israelites allowed their fear to overshadow their faith, and they rebelled once again, refusing to enter the land God had promised them. This act of disobedience and lack of trust led to God's decision that the Israelites would wander the desert for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had spent scouting the land. It was a time of purification, a period where the older generation, those who doubted and rebelled, would pass away, leaving a new generation to inherit the promise. Moses continued to lead them faithfully during this time, teaching them, guiding them, and reminding them of God's faithfulness, even as they walked through the wilderness. The journey to the Promised Land became a symbol of the struggle between faith and fear, obedience and rebellion, and the need to trust in God's timing, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. As we reflect on the incredible journey of Moses and the Israelites, one thing becomes abundantly clear. God's plans always prevail, even when the path seems uncertain or filled with obstacles. Just as Moses remained faithful to his calling despite facing countless challenges, we, too, are called to trust God's purpose for our lives. This journey of faith is not always easy, and often we find ourselves in deserts of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. But just like Moses, we must keep moving forward, trusting that God is leading us to our own promised land. His guidance, love, and promises are unchanging, even when our circumstances shift. Now, if you find yourself in a place where you're longing for God's guidance, healing, or a deeper connection with Him, there's something I want to share with you. The Miracle of 7 Days Healing is more than just a guide. It's a transformative journey. It's designed to help you break through spiritual barriers, find clarity, and experience the fullness of God's love and power in your life. The link to this guide is pinned in the first comment below, and I truly believe it can be a life-changing resource for those seeking to deepen their faith and understanding of God's promises. Moses' story teaches us that no matter how challenging the journey, God's grace is always sufficient, and His plans are greater than our fears. As you continue on your path, remember to seek God earnestly, remain obedient, and never lose sight of His promises. If this story has inspired you or brought new insight, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. There are many more stories and lessons that we can explore together, so I invite you to watch another video from this channel, where we dive even deeper into the wonders of God's Word. Thank you for joining me today, and may God's blessings be with you always.